Okay, so the first challenge for secondary data analysis is having prior knowledge of the data. And this is because researchers often analyse the same data sets multiple times throughout their careers. And this is usually for good reasons. For example, the data sets might have really good measures, or they might have other advantages that are particular strengths for our particular areas of research. But on the downside, having prior knowledge of the data might lead to potential insight into the results and induce bias in that way. And so in order to kind of increase transparency about this, one thing that we can do is report our prior access to the data. And this is actually now required when we pre-register secondary data analysis plans on the OSF according or in line with the template that was developed by Olmo van den Akker. So in particular, we're encouraged so for each author to state whether they've accessed the data set previously, and if so, whether they've accessed key variables and which ones, such as exposure variables or outcome variables, and to also include a citation of the resulting publication to kind of provide additional transparency about what analyses were conducted when using the data set or the key variables. And this information can be provided through self-certification, which obviously does rely on trust that the researchers are being honest. But other more objective ways to provide this data could be through a letter from an independent gatekeeper, such as a data manager, explaining which of the authors have accessed the data set previously and when and which variables they might have accessed. Or alternatively, if cohorts set up some kind of electronic data checkout system, which could involve, for example, just automatically recording which researchers might say download the data or be sent the data, the date they've accessed it, and so on. That would be really helpful, because then researchers could just search the name of their co-authors and have the kind of history for each author of whether they've accessed the data set previously and what that data access involved. And it's important to highlight that just reporting our prior access to the data doesn't prevent biases linked to prior knowledge of the data, but it does make these biases transparent. But for a more rigorous solution that can really help to mitigate against these biases, researchers can consider using a multiverse analysis. So a multiverse analysis is an approach which involves identifying every potential analytic choice that can be made or that can be used to analyse a particular research question. So every possible different type of analysis that could be done. So this includes things like different ways to operationalize a variable, different ways to code a variable, different statistical models to use, and different patterns of covariates. And these all need to be justifiable. So only things that could reasonably be done for kind of good reasons to test the relevant question. So once all of these different analytic choices have been identified, and these are often termed specifications, researchers run all of the different analyses, which often include thousands, and then they can report the results from all possible specifications. And so this graph shows an example of a multiverse approach by Amy Orban, looking at the relationship between digital technology use and well-being in adolescents. And so down here, we see the different analytic choices. So, for example, different ways to operationalize technology use, different measures to indicate well-being, different informants, and different statistical controls. And each dot represents the particular specification or combination of all of these things that were included. And then up here we can see the effect sizes associated with the different specifications. So you can see that the effect sizes really range quite considerably from a moderate negative association to a kind of small positive association, with the average effects shown here. And so this approach is really effective in preventing things like selective reporting, because it shows the results from all possible analytic approaches. And it's very transparent in this way, which means that it's really effective in situations where researchers have already accessed the data, because although they might have maybe some insight into the potential results, it's extremely unlikely that they would have conducted thousands, here 20,000 different analyses to test this question before pre-registering. So it can really help to prevent the biases that might lead to selective reporting or p-hacking and things like that. So while this approach is really rigorous, that potentially has a bit of a downside in that it could be quite computationally demanding to run and potentially quite challenging to come up with all of these different specifications. But there are new packages that are being developed or that have already been developed to kind of standardize this process and make it more efficient. So I think that's really optimistic for future multiverse analyses. Okay, so the second challenge that pre-registration can present for secondary data analysis is that the research may not be hypothesis driven. So pre-registration and registered reports are really tailored towards confirmatory hypothesis driven research. But much research involving secondary data analysis is descriptive, exploratory, or more focused on estimation. So, for example, testing the magnitude and robustness of an effect size. So this might lead some researchers to think that maybe pre-registration isn't relevant for them if they don't have a strong and clear hypothesis. But one solution to this is to pre-register research questions, analysis plans, and conditions for interpretation. And this is because research based on secondary data analysis doesn't need to have a hypothesis to benefit from pre-registration. Pre-registering research questions that are very clear and specific and analysis plans can help to limit analytic flexibility and prevent selective reporting and p-hacking. And pre-registering specific conditions for interpreting the results can limit post hoc interpretations. So by interpreting the results in a slightly biased way only once you've observed them. And there has been, or there is, detailed guidance on the OSF template for pre-registering secondary data analysis about how to pre-register research questions and analysis plans in kind of sufficient detail. But in terms of pre-registering conditions for interpretation, here's a kind of a small example, which I won't go into too much detail about, but the aim is to really pre-specify as much as possible all potential different results that you might obtain. So here, for example, with this research question, we might obtain 3 kind of broad patterns of results. And for each result, to state what interpretation you would make from that. The more detailed, the better, really, because that really limits the space for additional kind of post hoc interpretation. So you might also want to consider things like effect size thresholds for interpretation. So what you consider to be a small, medium or large effect and how that would affect your interpretation and meaning that you draw from the results. And things like the smallest effect size of interest in the context of equivalence testing. And it's worth noting that pre-specifying conditions for interpreting results is recommended, if not mandatory now, in registered reports. So it could be worth having a look at example registered reports and just seeing how exactly they come up with these kind of different results, and then how they would interpret each one. And really, the more detailed and specific, the better. Okay, so for researchers that are interested in integrating pre-registration into a kind of exploratory approach, they might consider using a holdout sample. And so this involves taking a data set which needs to be sufficiently large and randomly splitting it into a training data set and a holdout data set. So on the training data set, you can conduct exploratory analysis, so kind of free from hypotheses and testing whatever you want really to make new discoveries in a really flexible way. After this exploratory analysis has been conducted, researchers can then pre-register the study based on maybe testing some of the research questions or hypotheses that might have been generated from the exploratory process, and then conducting the pre-registered confirmatory analysis in the holdout sample. So this approach kind of enables a really flexible discovery process before testing more confirmatory analyses in a non-biased way. And it's particularly could be useful for situations when access to independent data sets is limited, although it needs to be, or the original data set does need to be kind of large enough to allow sufficient power in the holdout sample, given that this is a reduced sample size from the original data set. Okay, so the third challenge of pre-registration is to ensure that the pre-registered analyses are appropriate for the data. So with pre-registration for all different types of data, including primary data, there's always a risk that the analyses will not be appropriate for the data, perhaps if the data violate an assumption of the analysis. But with secondary data, the extent to which the data can shape the analyses can be quite considerable. So as some examples, with longitudinal cohort studies, there's often attrition and missing data. But the kind of type of analysis that you might do to account for the missingness really depends on the characteristics of the missing data, such as whether it's missing at random or not. Additionally, much kind of secondary data that we might use, such as electronic health records, was never actually collected with the purpose of research. So there could be many challenges in analysing the data that are really impossible to predict in advance. And also, more generally, characteristics of the data often shape the analyses that we do. For example, we often have to check things like collinearity before kind of choosing predictors to go in a multivariate regression model, or understanding the kind of amount of missing data if we're deriving a kind of composite score. So researchers might be kind of concerned about pre-registering specific analysis plan without having some kind of understanding of the data characteristics. So one solution to this is to trial the analyses on a blinded data set before pre-registering. And what I mean by a blinded data set is one in which the values are obscured, or the data labels are obscured. So researchers don't gain any insight into the actual results, but they do understand some of the characteristics of the data. So one form of data blinding is known as data scrambling. And this basically involves taking a data set and randomly scrambling or shuffling the values within rows or within cells. So if we take this kind of simple data set as an example, if we scrambled it by columns, the scrambled data set could look a bit like this. So focusing on the first column, we see that we've got values of 5, 3 and missing. And then in the scrambled data set, the values remain as 3, missing and 5. So the values are the same, but they're just in different cells. And importantly, this means that the data distribution is the same in the blinded data set. So the means and the variances will all be the same. The amount of missingness is also the same in the blinded data set. So we can assess kind of the amounts of missing data that are present. But importantly, any associations between variables will be different in the blinded data set. So we wouldn't gain any insight into the overall results. And so this is a kind of approach that could be implemented at the cohort level. So for example, if a researcher is interested in pre-registering an analysis on that data set, the data manager could provide a blinded data set for the researcher so they can assess some of these characteristics of the data, potentially refine some of their analyses if they find that some of the assumptions are violated. And then once they've refined the analyses, they then can go ahead and pre-register the study analysis plan with more confidence that the kind of analytic assumptions won't be violated when they come to do the analyses. So one really minor, or maybe not so minor, but one limitation with this approach is that although we can assess the data distribution and the missingness, because we can't see any associations between variables, we wouldn't be able to assess some things, for example, like collinearity between variables or even predictors of missing data. But the following solution can address those problems. And this is basically to do something really similar, but to trial analyses on a data set missing the outcome variable. So, for example, a data manager could send the researcher a data set with information on the exposure variables, the covariates, but no data on the outcome. And this could mean that researchers could assess multivariable distributional characteristics and assess things like collinearity between variables and predictors of missing data. But crucially, they wouldn't be able to look at any relationships between exposures or covariates with the outcome, which is usually the kind of main point of interest or analysis done in the actual research that they want to conduct. And if researchers are kind of concerned about the fact that they wouldn't have any data on the outcome, so they wouldn't know the amount of missing data in it, for example, or the distribution, this approach could actually be kind of mixed with the data scrambling approach. So researchers could receive a scrambled outcome variable. So they're able to assess the distributional characteristics of the outcome. They still wouldn't be able to look at any relationships with the exposures. Okay, so the fourth challenge relates to a lack of flexibility in data analysis due to pre-registration. So researchers have raised, or some researchers have raised concerns that pre-registration can limit necessary flexibility in data analysis, for example, to make new discoveries in exploratory research, or to implement a new kind of advantageous method that's recently developed, or to kind of follow up on an interesting finding with post-hoc analyses. And as I'll kind of come to discuss, this concern is perhaps overstated, because actually pre-registration doesn't prevent researchers from doing this, but it just encourages them to make it more transparent what's post-hoc and what was pre-registered. But another understandable concern that researchers might have is that pre-registered studies have been associated with a higher report or greater reporting of null findings. So yeah, pre-registered studies, when empirical analyses have checked this, they found that pre-registered studies are more likely to report null results. And this is likely because pre-registration reduces analytic flexibility and prevents these questionable research practices like p-hacking. And although reporting null results that are true is a really positive outcome for research integrity, researchers might be concerned that this might kind of damage or harm their careers in some way, because we also know that, unfortunately, in the current climate, and especially in the past, null findings are harder to get published, and they're also less likely to be cited. So there could be a concern that by kind of committing to pre-registering, you're more likely to have to report null results, and it could be more difficult to get your paper published. So to address this, I think we can take steps to ensure that the value of a paper doesn't depend on having statistically significant results. And there are a number of ways that we can do this. So firstly, by adopting high quality methods, we can increase the likelihood that our paper will make a valuable contribution regardless of the findings. So kind of taking the time to think carefully and thoughtfully about our study plans when we're designing it, and taking steps to make sure we have high power, we're using valid and reliable measures, implementing robustness checks to kind of rule out alternative explanations, and using replication samples to kind of test the generalizability of our findings. We can also implement alternatives to null hypothesis significance testing, such as Bayesian methods and equivalence tests, which allow better interpretation of null findings, which is in contrast to traditional null hypothesis significance testing. And somewhat related to this, we can also place more emphasis on things like confidence intervals rather than p-values. So focusing on kind of the magnitude and range of effects rather than simply whether it's statistically significant or not. And finally, arguably the most effective way to prevent ourselves from publication bias is to conduct a registered report, because if the study is deemed to be of a high kind of importance in terms of the topic and the methods are considered to be really strong, then the journal will commit to publishing the study regardless of the results if it's kind of accepted after the stage 1 peer review based on the quality of the protocol and the topic importance. And in relation to the concern that pre-registration can limit flexibility in conducting unplanned analyses, I think it's quite or more well known now, but these can be included, but they have to be transparently reported. So, for example, researchers, if they're using a new method, for example, they can highlight either in an amendment to the pre-registration or in the manuscript, potentially in the supplementary material, if there's a tight word count and they're linking to this from the main article so it's clear. They can report the changes to the study, the reason why the change was made, for example, if a new method offered particular advantages, or something went wrong with the previous analysis, if the data maybe violated some of the assumptions made. And ideally, if possible, report results from the original method to show that the choice in deviating wasn't because of the results, it was because of the other kind of methodological reason. And this is now the kind of option to include an amendment to the pre-registration is now available on the OSF pre-registration site, so that's really handy. And it can also be reported in the manuscript.